There is a particular kind of exhaustion that no one talks about. It is not the exhaustion that comes from working too hard or sleeping too little. It is deeper than that. It is the exhaustion of constantly making yourself smaller so that other people feel more comfortable. The exhaustion of swallowing your opinions to keep the peace. Of saying yes when every part of you is screaming no. Of going above and beyond for people who would not cross the street for you. You know this feeling. You have felt it after a conversation where you agreed with someone you completely disagreed with, just to avoid tension. You have felt it after doing a favor for someone who never even said thank you. You have felt it lying awake at night, replaying moments where you had every right to speak up, to push back, to simply say enough, and yet you said nothing. And the most painful part is this: you are not a bad person. You are not weak. You are not broken. You are someone who was taught that being kind, agreeable, and accommodating was the way to be loved, the way to be accepted, the way to keep people close and life peaceful. So you became very, very good at it. You became the person people call when they need something. The one who holds everything together while quietly falling apart. The one who gives and gives and gives, and somehow, inexplicably, still feels alone. Still feels unseen. Still feels like no matter how much you do, it is never quite enough to earn the respect you deserve. Here is what nobody told you. Kindness, when it comes from fear, fear of rejection, fear of conflict, fear of being abandoned, is not really kindness at all. It is a survival strategy wearing a generous disguise. And while it may keep the surface of your relationship smooth, it slowly hollows you out from the inside. It teaches people, without a single word being spoken, exactly how to treat you. And they do. They take the extra mile you walk as the new minimum. They take your patience as permission. They take your silence as agreement. Not because they are all terrible people, but because you have shown them, consistently and quietly, that there are no consequences for taking you for granted. But here is the truth that will change everything if you allow it to settle in. Respect is not given to those who need it the most. It is given to those who require it. There is a profound difference between begging for respect through endless acts of kindness and commanding respect through the quiet, unshakable certainty of who you are. One exhausts you. The other liberates you. This audiobook is about that liberation. Across 10 deeply honest chapters, we are going to walk together through the psychology of overkindness, where it comes from, what it costs you, and how it quietly shapes every relationship in your life. We are going to explore the paradox of respect, why the people who give the most are often valued the least, and what the most admired, most trusted, most genuinely loved people in the world do differently. We are going to talk about boundaries, not as cold walls you build to keep people out, but as the quiet architecture of a life lived on your own terms. We are going to talk about the language of self-respect, the presence that commands a room without saying a word, and the deep inner work that makes everything else possible. And we are going to do all of this without asking you to become hard, without asking you to become cold, selfish, or indifferent to the people you love. Because the goal is not to stop being kind. The goal is to become someone whose kindness is a choice, not a compulsion. Someone who gives freely, loves deeply, and holds firm, all at the same time. Someone who is warm and powerful, gentle and unshakable, open and completely, quietly, immovably themselves. That person already exists inside you. This audiobook is simply the path back to them. So find a quiet place. Take a breath. And let us begin. If this is already speaking to something you have felt but never had words for, stay with us. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because every chapter of this journey is going to go deeper, and you do not want to miss a single one. Chapter 1. The Kindness Trap. There is a version of kindness that the world celebrates. It shows up in the person who always has time for others, who never makes waves, who smooths over tension with a smile and a willingness to compromise. The person who remembers everyone's birthdays, who stays late to help, who never asks for too much and never complains when they receive too little. The world looks at this person and calls them good. And for a long time, Perhaps for most of your life, you believed that being that person was exactly what you were supposed to be. So you kept showing up. You kept giving. You kept making yourself available, agreeable, and easy to be around. You swallowed discomfort. You absorbed other people's moods. You reshaped yourself, quietly and constantly, to fit into whatever space a situation required of you. And it worked, in a way. People liked you. They relied on you. They called you dependable, selfless, easygoing. And those words felt good, because they sounded like compliments. They sounded like proof that you were doing life right. But somewhere beneath all of that, beneath the smiles and the favors and the endless accommodation, something was quietly breaking. It rarely happens all at once. The kindness trap does not announce itself. It does not arrive with a warning or a dramatic moment of betrayal. It builds slowly, almost invisibly, through thousands of small moments where you chose someone else's comfort over your own truth. It was the time you laughed at a joke that actually hurt you. It was the time you lent money you could not afford to someone who never offered to pay it back. It was the time someone spoke to you in a way that was completely unacceptable, and instead of addressing it, you told yourself it was not worth the argument. It was the time you stayed in a friendship, a relationship, a job, long past the point where it stopped serving you, because you did not want to seem difficult, did not want to hurt anyone, did not want to be the one who walked away. Each of those moments on its own seems small, manageable, even noble. But add them together over months, over years, over a lifetime, and what you have is not a life of kindness. What you have is a life of quiet self-abandonment. A life where everyone else's needs have been consistently placed above your own, not because you are extraordinarily generous, but because somewhere along the way, you stopped believing your own needs mattered enough to defend. That is the kindness trap. And it is one of the most invisible, most insidious traps a human being can fall into, because it disguises itself as a virtue. To understand why so many people fall into this trap, we have to understand something fundamental about human psychology. From the moment we are born, we are wired for connection. The need to belong, to be accepted, loved, and valued by other people, is not a weakness. It is biology. It is survival. In our earliest days as a species, being rejected from the group was not just painful. It was dangerous. Exile meant death. So we evolved to be exquisitely sensitive to social signals. We became finely tuned to notice when others are pleased with us, and deeply unsettled when they are not. We learned quickly and efficiently what behaviors earn us acceptance and what behaviors risk rejection. For many people, especially those who grew up in environments where love felt conditional, where approval had to be earned through good behavior, through being helpful, through not causing trouble, the lesson learned was a simple and powerful one. If I am agreeable, I will be loved. If I cause conflict, I will lose love. This lesson, absorbed in childhood, becomes the operating system of an adult life. It runs silently in the background of every interaction, every relationship, every moment where you must choose between your truth and someone else's comfort. And most of the time, without even realizing it, you choose their comfort. Not because you are cowardly. Not because you do not know your own mind. But because the part of you that is still in some deep and unexamined way, that child seeking approval, that part is terrified of what happens if you stop being so easy to love. Let us be honest about the price. Because this is not simply an abstract philosophical problem. The kindness trap has real, concrete, measurable costs, and they show up in every area of your life. The first cost is your relationships. When you consistently prioritize everyone else's needs above your own, you do not create deeper connections. You create imbalanced ones. You become the giver in a dynamic where others have become comfortable being takers, not because they are inherently selfish, but because you have established and repeatedly confirmed the terms of the relationship through your behavior. Over time, resentment grows. Not loudly. Not dramatically, but quietly, in the private corners of your inner world, you begin to feel it. A slow burning frustration with the people you love most. An exhaustion with friendships that always seem to flow in one direction. A loneliness that makes no logical sense because you are surrounded by people, and yet somehow, no one truly sees you. That loneliness is one of the most specific pains a kind person carries. Because you have given so much of yourself to so many people, and yet the real you, the one with opinions, with limits, with needs and frustrations and desires, that person has never fully shown up. They have been hidden, carefully and consistently, behind the performance of pleasantness. And you cannot be truly known by people who have only ever met your performance. The second cost is your self-worth. Every time you silence yourself to keep peace, a message is sent, not to the other person but to you. The message is this: my feelings are less important than this person's comfort. My needs are less valid than their expectations of me. Repeat that message enough times, and you begin to believe it. This is how chronic people-pleasing quietly dismantles confidence. Not through a single crushing blow, but through the slow accumulation of moments where you failed to show up for yourself. Where you were your own last priority. Where you treated your own inner world as something inconvenient, something to be managed and suppressed rather than honored and expressed. And once your self-worth erodes to a certain level, the trap becomes self-reinforcing. Because now you do not just fear losing others' approval, you genuinely do not feel worthy of asking for anything more. The cage is no longer locked from the outside. You are holding the door shut yourself. The third cost, and perhaps the most ironic, is the respect you were trying to earn. Here is the brutal paradox at the heart of the kindness trap. The very thing you were hoping your kindness would earn you, love, appreciation, respect, is the very thing it tends to repel. Not always. Not immediately. But over time, consistently, there is a pattern that plays out in human relationships with almost mathematical precision. The more available you make yourself, the less people value your presence. The more you give without expectation, the more your giving is taken for granted. The more you accommodate, the more accommodation is expected. The more you shrink, the more the space you leave gets filled by someone else's ego, someone else's agenda, someone else's comfort. It is not fair. It is not kind. But it is deeply, fundamentally human. People, even good people, even people who love you, will unconsciously calibrate their treatment of you to the standard you set for how you allow yourself to be treated. And if that standard is "I will accept anything to keep you happy," then anything is precisely what you will receive. There comes a point for many people, and perhaps you are at that point right now, which is why you are here, where the kindness trap becomes impossible to ignore. It might arrive as a quiet moment of clarity in an ordinary day. A friend cancels on you for the third time, and instead of the usual wave of understanding and forgiveness, something in you simply goes still. A colleague takes credit for your work, and the smile you offer in response feels so hollow that you barely recognize yourself in it. A partner says something dismissive, and for the first time you do not rush to smooth it over. You just sit with it, and feel the full weight of how long this has been going on. These moments of recognition are not breakdowns. They are breakthroughs. They are the first honest conversation your soul has been allowed to have with you in a very long time. And what it is telling you, quietly, clearly, with absolute certainty, is this: something has to change. Not the people around you. Not the circumstances of your life. Not your fundamental nature, your warmth, your capacity for love and generosity. You. Specifically, the relationship you have with yourself. The value you assign to your own experience. The standards you hold for how you deserve to be treated. The voice inside you that has been waiting, patiently and painfully, for permission to finally speak. That is where the change begins. Not in dramatic declarations or sudden personality transformations. Not in becoming someone harder, colder, or more difficult to love. But in the quiet revolutionary act of deciding, perhaps for the first time in your life, that you matter too. Before we move forward, there is something important to establish, because this chapter, and indeed this entire audiobook, is not an argument against kindness. Kindness is one of the most powerful forces in human life. It builds trust, deepens connection, heals wounds, and creates the kind of relationships that make life genuinely worth living. A world with more kindness in it is unambiguously a better world. But there are two fundamentally different kinds of kindness, and the distance between them is the distance between a life of quiet misery and a life of genuine fulfillment. The first kind of kindness comes from fear. It gives because it is afraid of what happens if it does not. It agrees because disagreement feels dangerous. It helps because saying no feels like an invitation to be abandoned. It is not really generosity. It is anxiety wearing a generous mask. The second kind of kindness comes from strength. It gives because it genuinely wants to. It helps because it has enough energy, enough resources, enough self-worth, that giving does not cost it anything it cannot afford. It says yes freely, and no without guilt. It loves without losing itself. The goal of everything that follows in this audiobook is to move you from the first kind of kindness to the second. Not to make you less generous, but to make your generosity real, unforced, unafraid, and rooted in the deep, quiet knowledge that you are someone worth respecting. Because when you know that, truly know it, everything changes. The way you speak changes. The way you carry yourself changes. The relationships you attract change. The way people instinctively treat you changes. Not because you became harder, but because you finally became whole. In Chapter 2, we go deeper, into the origins of overkindness, into the early experiences and invisible beliefs that turned you into someone who gives too much and asks for too little. Understanding where this began is not about assigning blame. It is about finally seeing the bars of the cage clearly enough to walk through them. Stay with us. Chapter 2, the root of the problem where overkindness really comes from. Nothing about you happened by accident. The way you move through the world, the way you shrink in certain rooms, the way you say yes when you mean no, the way you feel a quiet panic rise in your chest at the first sign of someone's disappointment, none of that appeared from nowhere. It was learned. Carefully, thoroughly, and mostly without your awareness, you were taught how to be. You were taught what was safe and what was dangerous. You were taught which version of yourself was acceptable and which version needed to be hidden. You were taught, through countless experiences both large and small, what you had to do to be loved. And you were a very good student. That is not a criticism. It is simply the truth of what it means to be human. We are, all of us, shaped by the environments we grew up in, by the families that raised us, the experiences that marked us, and the conclusions we drew from both. We did not choose those environments. We did not choose those experiences. We simply adapted to them, the way all living things adapt, by finding the strategy most likely to ensure our survival. For many people who struggle with overkindness, that strategy was accommodation. And to understand why, we need to go back to the beginning. Imagine a child. This child is young enough that the world is still entirely defined by the people who take care of them. Parents, guardians, older siblings, whoever holds authority in their world. These people are not just important to the child. They are everything. They are safety. They are food, warmth, comfort, and belonging. They are the entire universe, compressed into a handful of human beings. Now imagine that in this universe, love feels unpredictable. Perhaps it is a parent whose affection runs hot and cold, warm and generous in good moods, withdrawn and critical when stressed. Perhaps it is a home where conflict is frequent and frightening, where raised voices signal danger and tension hangs in the air like smoke. Perhaps it is a quieter dynamic, a parent who is not cruel, but whose approval is clearly tied to performance. To good grades, to good behavior, to being helpful and undemanding and easy. Or perhaps it is something else entirely. Perhaps it is a household where one parent is struggling, with illness, with grief, with addiction, and the child, in that particular way that children do, has taken on the unspoken responsibility of keeping the emotional temperature of the home manageable, of being good, of not adding to the burden, of making themselves as small and as pleasant as possible so that the fragile peace of the household is not disturbed. In each of these scenarios, the child is learning a lesson, not from a textbook, not from a lecture, but from the raw, repeated experience of living, from noticing what happens when they express certain needs, when they push back against certain rules, when they show certain emotions. And the lesson, in each case, is a variation of the same theme. Who I am naturally is too much, or not enough, or somehow dangerous. But if I adjust, if I make myself more agreeable, more helpful, more careful, I can earn the love and safety I need. This lesson does not stay in childhood. It travels with you. It grows up alongside you. It sits quietly inside every adult relationship you ever have, whispering its old instructions even when the circumstances have completely changed. Psychology has long recognized that our earliest relationships create what are called attachment patterns, deep, largely unconscious templates for how we relate to other people, how safe we feel in relationships, and what we believe we must do to maintain connection. For those who grew up with consistent, responsive caregiving, where their needs were met reliably and their emotions were welcomed rather than punished, the attachment pattern that develops is one of security. These individuals tend to move through adult relationships with a fundamental sense of ease. They trust that they are lovable. They trust that expressing needs will not drive people away. They can be close without losing themselves and separate without fearing abandonment. But for those whose early experiences were less consistent, where love felt conditional, where emotional expression led to punishment or withdrawal, where safety was something that had to be carefully managed rather than simply felt, a different kind of attachment develops. One built on vigilance. These individuals learn to read other people's moods with extraordinary precision. They become exquisitely attuned to the emotional atmosphere of any room they enter, alert to the first subtle signs of tension or displeasure. They develop a kind of emotional radar, a sixth sense for when someone is unhappy and a compulsive need to do something about it. Because in their original world, someone being unhappy was not just uncomfortable. It was a threat. It meant withdrawal of love, eruption of conflict, or the collapse of the fragile safety they had worked so hard to maintain. And so they became fixers, soothers, accommodators. People who move through life with one eye permanently trained on the emotional state of others, ready at any moment to adjust, to apologize, to give more, whatever it takes to bring the temperature back down. This is not a character flaw. It is a survival strategy that once made perfect sense. The problem is that survival strategies designed for childhood environments are not always useful, and are often actively harmful, when carried unchanged into adult life. Beyond the early attachment wounds, there is another layer to the kindness trap, and it lives in the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. Because over time, the coping strategies of childhood do not remain simply as behaviors. They become identities. The child who learned to keep the peace becomes the adult who defines themselves as a peacekeeper. The child who earned love through helpfulness becomes the adult whose entire sense of self-worth is tied to being useful. The child who suppressed anger and sadness to maintain harmony becomes the adult who genuinely believes they do not get angry, or that their sadness is not important enough to burden others with. These identities feel real. They feel like the truth of who you are. They feel like personality rather than pattern. And that is precisely what makes them so difficult to examine. Because if you have spent 30, 40, 50 years believing that your value lies in your usefulness, that you are most lovable when you are most giving, then the idea of pulling back, of saying no, of putting yourself first, does not just feel uncomfortable. It feels like a threat to your entire sense of self. Who are you, if not the helpful one? Who are you, if not the one who holds it all together? Who are you, if you stop making yourself endlessly available and begin, for the first time, to take up a little more space? These are not small questions. They are among the most profound questions a person can ask. And the fact that they feel frightening is not a sign that you should not ask them. It is a sign that the answers have the power to change your life. Underneath all of it, underneath the childhood wounds, the attachment patterns, the identities built on helpfulness, there is fear. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because fear is rarely what it appears to be on the surface. When you feel that familiar anxiety at the thought of disappointing someone, it does not feel like fear. It feels like consideration. It feels like caring about the other person's feelings. It feels like being a good friend, a good partner, a good person. But trace it back far enough, follow that anxiety to its root, and what you almost always find is a fear so old and so deep that it has become invisible. The fear of being rejected. The fear of being abandoned. The fear of being seen as selfish, as difficult, as too much, and therefore losing the love and connection you have worked so hard to secure. These fears are not irrational. They have a history. They were formed in moments when connection genuinely did feel threatened, when expressing a need did lead to withdrawal, when pushing back did lead to punishment, when being yourself did feel unsafe. But the person you are today is not the child you were then. The relationships you have now, or the ones you are capable of building, are not the same as the ones that first taught you to be afraid. And the most important thing you can understand, as we sit with this chapter together, is that fear-based kindness is not protecting you from anything. It is simply keeping you trapped in a pattern that was formed in a world that no longer exists. There is one more thread worth pulling here, because it shows up so frequently in people who struggle with overkindness, and yet it is rarely discussed in this context. Perfectionism. On the surface, perfectionism and people-pleasing might seem like different problems. But at their core, they share the same root, the belief that your natural self is somehow not enough. That you must earn your place in other people's lives through performance, through effort, through being endlessly impressive or endlessly useful or endlessly agreeable. The perfectionist and the people-pleaser are both, in their own ways, running from the same fear, that if people saw the real them, unpolished and unperforming, they would not be chosen, would not be loved, would not be enough. And so the perfectionist works harder, achieves more, tries to become undeniable. And the people-pleaser gives more, accommodates more, tries to become indispensable. Different strategies. Same wound. If you recognize yourself in either description, or in both, then what this chapter is gently pointing toward is not a list of new behaviors to adopt or new performances to perfect. It is something far more fundamental. It is the radical, quietly revolutionary act of beginning to believe, perhaps for the first time, that you are enough as you are. Not as you perform. Not as you give. Not as you accommodate and smooth over and make yourself useful and pleasant and easy. As you simply, inherently, unmistakably are. Before we move on, there is something I want to say directly, because it matters. Listening a chapter like this one, looking honestly at the roots of a pattern that has shaped your life, can bring up a complicated mixture of feelings. Recognition, relief, but also, sometimes, grief, anger, a quiet sadness for the younger version of yourself who had to learn these strategies in order to survive. Let those feelings come. They are not weakness. They are honesty. And honesty is precisely where healing begins. But alongside those feelings, I want to offer you this. Understanding where overkindness comes from is not an invitation to blame yourself, or to blame the people who shaped you. Most of them were doing the best they could with what they had. Most of the wounds were not inflicted with cruelty, but with the quiet thoughtlessness that comes from people who were themselves never taught how to do better. You are not broken. You are not permanently damaged by what happened to you. You are someone who developed a very understandable set of responses to a very specific set of circumstances. And the extraordinary thing about human beings, the thing that separates us from every other creature, is our capacity to look at our own patterns with clear eyes, understand them, and consciously choose something different. That is not just possible for you. It is already beginning. The fact that you are here, sitting with these ideas, willing to look honestly at the roots of something that has cost you so much, that is not a small thing. That is courage. And courage, quiet and unglamorous as it sometimes looks, is always where transformation begins. In Chapter 3, we turn outward, to examine one of the most counterintuitive truths in all of human psychology. Why the people who give the most are so often respected the least. Why the people who hold firm attract more genuine love and admiration. And what the dynamics of respect actually look like beneath the surface of our relationships. It is a chapter that will challenge some of your deepest assumptions, and in doing so, set you free from some of your most limiting ones. Stay with us. But before we continue, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want you to think about this. Think back to the very first time you remember putting someone else's feelings completely ahead of your own. The first time you said yes and meant no. The first time you stayed quiet when everything inside you wanted to speak. How old were you? Where were you? And more importantly, do you think that moment quietly shaped the way you move through relationships even today? Drop it in the comments. It does not have to be long. It does not have to be perfectly worded. Just one honest sentence about when you first learned to put yourself last. You might be surprised how many people reading your words right now have been carrying the exact same story. And sometimes, just seeing that you are not alone in it is the first thing that begins to loosen its hold on you. Chapter 3: The Respect Paradox: Why People Admire What They Cannot Fully Have. There is a truth about human nature that most people spend their entire lives bumping into without ever fully understanding. And it is this: we do not deeply respect what is endlessly available to us. Not because we are cruel. Not because we are ungrateful. But because of something far more fundamental, something wired into the very architecture of how human beings assign value. Think about it for a moment in the simplest possible terms. Water is essential to life. Without it, you would be dead in 3 days. And yet, for most people in the developed world, water is the thing they think about least. It is always there. It flows freely from the tap at any hour of the day or night. It costs almost nothing. And precisely because of that, precisely because of its endless, effortless availability, it is taken entirely for granted. Now think about a diamond. A diamond has no nutritional value. It will not keep you warm. It will not quench your thirst or heal your wounds. In purely practical terms, it is almost completely useless. And yet people assign it extraordinary value. They work years to afford one. They protect it carefully. They treat it as precious. Why? Because it is rare. Because it is not easily obtained. Because its scarcity signals something significant, and that signal, entirely independent of the object's practical worth, creates a perception of value that overrides all logic. Now here is the uncomfortable question. In your relationships, in the way you show up for the people in your life, are you behaving more like water or more like a diamond? Let us bring this out of metaphor and into the reality of human relationships, because this is where it becomes both deeply uncomfortable and deeply important. When you are endlessly available, when you respond to every message immediately, when you drop everything at the first sign that someone needs you, when you have no plans that cannot be rearranged and no boundaries that cannot be crossed, you are not communicating love. You are communicating desperation. And desperation, however generously it is dressed, does not inspire respect. It inspires a very different response, one that most people would never consciously choose to have, but have nonetheless. It inspires a quiet, often unconscious devaluation. This is not malicious. It is not even intentional in most cases. It is simply the human mind doing what it has always done, using availability as a signal of worth. When something is always there, always accessible, always willing to accommodate, the mind files it under reliable background. Essential, perhaps, but not precious, not remarkable, not something to be handled with particular care. And so the very things you do in the hope of making yourself more loved, the constant availability, the endless accommodation, the tireless giving, quietly produce the opposite of what you intended. Not always immediately, not always obviously, but over time, in the subtle shifting dynamics of your closest relationships, the pattern plays out with painful consistency. The more you give without limit, the less your giving is noticed. The more you accommodate without condition, the more your accommodation is expected. The more you make yourself easy to take for granted, the more you are taken for granted. So if endless availability erodes respect, what builds it? This is where things get genuinely interesting, because the answer runs counter to almost everything most kind people have been taught to believe. Respect, at its core, is a response to perceived value. And perceived value in human relationships is shaped by a remarkably consistent set of signals. The first signal is selectivity. The people we most respect are not the ones who are available to everyone for everything. They are the ones whose time and attention feel like something worth having, because it is not automatically given. When someone whose time is clearly valuable chooses to give it to you, that feels meaningful. When someone whose attention is clearly not automatic focuses it on you, that feels significant. The second signal is standards. We respect people who hold a clear sense of what they will and will not accept. Not because we enjoy being held to standards. In the short term, it can feel uncomfortable, but because standards communicate something important. They communicate that this person knows who they are, that they have a relationship with their own values that is more important to them than your momentary approval. And something in us recognizes that as strength. Something in us leans toward it, even when another part of us is bristling against it. The third signal is self-possession. There is a quality that the most respected people in any room share, a quality that is difficult to define precisely but impossible to miss when you encounter it. It is a kind of settled certainty, a comfort in their own skin that does not need external validation to sustain itself. They are not performing for the room. They are not monitoring your reaction to calibrate their next move. They are simply, fully, quietly themselves, and that solidity, that rootedness, creates a gravitational pull that more anxious, more accommodating personalities simply cannot replicate. These three signals, selectivity, standards, and self-possession, are not things you can fake. Not for long. Not convincingly. But they are things you can genuinely develop. And the chapters ahead will show you exactly how. Here is where we need to pause and acknowledge something. Most of us were taught, explicitly or implicitly, that the way to earn love and respect was to be giving, accommodating, and selfless. We were told by well-meaning parents, by culture, by religion, by the stories we grew up with, that the highest virtue was to put others first. That asking for too much was selfish. That holding firm was unkind. And there is a partial truth in those teachings. Genuine generosity is beautiful. Selflessness, when it comes from a place of real abundance, is one of the most admirable qualities a human being can possess. Putting others first, in the right moments, for the right reasons, is a mark of genuine character. But those teachings left something out. They left out the distinction between generosity and self-erasure. They left out the difference between choosing to give and being unable to stop giving out of fear. They left out the crucial fact that you cannot pour from an empty vessel, and that a person who has given away every last drop of themselves has nothing real left to offer anyone. They also left out what the research consistently shows, and what human experience confirms again and again, that the most genuinely loved, genuinely respected, genuinely admired people in the world are not the ones who gave the most indiscriminately. They are the ones who gave meaningfully, selectively, from a place of real choice. Whose yes meant something because their no was also possible. Think about the people in your own life, past or present, whom you have most genuinely respected. Not the people you relied on most. Not the people who were most available or most accommodating. But the ones you truly looked up to. The ones whose opinion of you actually mattered. The ones you thought about differently from the rest. Now ask yourself honestly, were those people endlessly available to you? Did they reshape themselves to fit your preferences? Did they agree with everything you said, accommodate every request, never push back or hold a position different from yours? Almost certainly not. In fact, if you think about it carefully, the people you most respect are probably people who, at some point, told you something you did not want to hear. Who held a position under pressure. Who said no to you and meant it. Who were warm and caring, but also, unmistakably, their own person. And that quality of being unmistakably their own person, is precisely what made them feel worth respecting. Now flip the lens. Think about someone in your life who has always been endlessly accommodating toward you. Someone who has never said no, never pushed back, never failed to be available whenever you needed them. Someone who has given and given and given, seemingly without limit. How do you feel about that person? If you are honest, genuinely, uncomfortably honest, there is a good chance that alongside the gratitude and the affection, there is also something else. Something you might not be proud of. A faint sense that you do not have to try very hard with this person. That their presence is guaranteed regardless of your behavior. That their good opinion of you costs you nothing to maintain. You may love this person. You may genuinely care about them. But do you respect them the way you respect someone who holds their ground? This is the paradox. And sitting with its discomfort is important, because the same dynamic that plays out in your observations of others is playing out, right now, in the way others experience you. There is a concept in philosophy and in psychology that speaks directly to this paradox. The idea that genuine love, genuine connection, genuine respect, can only exist between people who are both fully present as themselves. You cannot truly connect with a mirror. When someone effaces themselves completely, when they have no edges, no resistance, no distinct selfhood that pushes back against yours, the relationship loses something essential. It loses the tension, the dynamic, the genuine encounter of two separate people meeting each other honestly. What remains can feel comfortable. It can feel safe. But it cannot feel truly alive. And it cannot generate the kind of deep, enduring respect that comes from genuinely knowing and being known by another person. The gift of not being easy, of having standards, of being selective, of occupying your own space with quiet confidence, is that it makes genuine connection possible. It gives the people in your life something real to connect with. Something solid. Something that does not simply reshape itself to accommodate their every preference, but stands firm enough to be truly encountered. And that encounter, that honest meeting of two whole people, is the only place where real respect is born. Here is what I want you to take from this chapter, not as a manipulation strategy, not as a technique for making people like you more, but as a genuine shift in how you understand yourself and your relationships. Holding your ground is not unkind. Having standards is not selfish. Being selective with your time and energy is not arrogance, it is self-respect made visible. And self-respect made visible is, in the deepest and most enduring sense, what commands the respect of others. Not because you are performing confidence. Not because you are strategically withholding yourself to manufacture desire. But because when you genuinely value yourself, when you treat your time, your energy, your emotional world as things worth protecting, that value communicates itself. It radiates outward. It changes the atmosphere of every room you enter and every relationship you inhabit. People feel it before they understand it. And they respond to it, with the attention, the consideration, and the genuine respect that you have always deserved, and that no amount of endless giving was ever able to earn you. Because respect was never something you needed to earn. It was always something you needed to claim. In Chapter 4, we begin the work of rebuilding, starting with one of the most important reframes in this entire audiobook. What kindness actually is when it comes from strength rather than fear. And how to begin shifting your own giving from something compulsive and exhausting into something that is genuinely, powerfully, freely chosen. Stay with us. Chapter 4, Redefining Kindness, the difference between strength and softness. There is a conversation that needs to happen. One that most self-help content on this subject quietly avoids, because it is easier to simply tell you to set boundaries, to say no more often, to stop letting people take advantage of you, than it is to sit with a more complex and more beautiful truth underneath all of that. And the truth is this. Kindness is not the problem. It has never been the problem. Kindness, real, genuine, freely chosen kindness, is one of the most extraordinary things one human being can offer another. It is the thread that holds relationships together. It is the quality that makes a person's presence in the world meaningful. It is, in the deepest sense, one of the clearest expressions of what it means to be fully human. The problem was never that you were too kind. The problem was that somewhere along the way, kindness stopped being something you chose, and became something you could not stop doing even when it was costing you everything. The problem was that kindness became confused with compliance. That generosity became entangled with fear. That the beautiful, powerful impulse to care for others got wrapped up in the desperate, exhausting need to be accepted by them. And that confusion between genuine kindness and fear-driven accommodation is what this chapter is here to untangle. Consider this image. Two people are standing in a desert. Both of them encounter a traveler who is thirsty and exhausted. Both of them offer the traveler a glass of water. The first person gives their water because they genuinely want to help. They have enough. The giving costs them something, but not more than they can afford. They offer it freely, without resentment, without expectation of anything in return. If the traveler takes the water and moves on without a word of thanks, the first person feels no bitterness, because the giving was never about the response it would generate. It was simply an expression of who they are. The second person also gives their water, but they give it from a place of anxiety. They are afraid that if they do not give, the traveler will think badly of them. They are afraid of the discomfort of saying no. They give even though they are also thirsty, even though they cannot truly afford to give, even though part of them resents the situation, because the alternative in their mind is worse. The alternative is disapproval, rejection, the unbearable sense of having failed to be good enough. Both people performed the same action. Both gave water to a thirsty traveler. But the internal experience, and the long-term cost, could not be more different. The first person gave from abundance. The second gave from fear. And while the traveler may never know the difference, your body knows. Your spirit knows. Because one of those experiences leaves you feeling expanded, more yourself, more connected, more alive. And the other leaves you feeling quietly depleted, quietly resentful, quietly wondering why doing good things so often leaves you feeling so empty. This is the distinction that changes everything. Not whether you give, but where the giving comes from. Fear-based kindness has a very specific texture. And once you learn to recognize it, you begin to see it everywhere, in your own behavior, in the behavior of others, in the dynamics of relationships all around you. It has several defining characteristics. The first is compulsion. Fear-based kindness does not feel like a choice. It feels like a necessity. When someone needs something, or when you merely perceive that they might need something, there is an almost automatic impulse to provide it. Not because you have considered whether you want to, or whether you are able to, or whether doing so serves either of you well, but because the discomfort of not doing it is greater than the discomfort of doing it. You give not because you want to give, but because you cannot bear not to. The second characteristic is resentment. Because fear-based kindness is not truly freely given, it accumulates a debt. A quiet, unspoken ledger of sacrifices made, and favors extended that were never asked for, but somehow still expected to be recognized and reciprocated. When they are not, and they often are not, because the other person never knew the ledger existed, the result is a particular kind of bitterness. Directed partly at the other person, but most painfully, at yourself. Because somewhere beneath the performance of cheerful generosity, you know that you gave what you could not afford to give, that you said yes when you meant no, that you smiled when you were screaming inside. And you cannot quite forgive yourself for it, even though you are not entirely sure what you did wrong. The third characteristic is invisibility. When you give from fear, you are not truly present in the exchange. You are performing a role, the generous one, the helpful one, the selfless one, and the real you with your actual feelings and needs and limits is watching from behind the performance. Hidden, safe, and completely, heartbreakingly unseen. This is why fear-based kindness, no matter how much of it you dispense, never truly satisfies the hunger it is trying to feed. Because the hunger is not for acts of generosity. The hunger is for genuine connection, for being truly known and truly valued by another person. And genuine connection requires the real you to show up. The performance will never be enough. Strength-based kindness feels entirely different. It begins with a foundation that fear-based kindness never has, a genuine sense of your own worth. Not arrogance. Not superiority. Simply the quiet, settled knowledge that you are enough. That your value does not depend on what you do for others. That you are lovable not for your usefulness, but for your existence. From that foundation, giving becomes something entirely different. It becomes an expression rather than a transaction. When you give from strength, you give because the act itself aligns with your values. Because helping in this particular moment, in this particular way, is something you genuinely want to do. You are not giving to earn approval. You are not giving to avoid discomfort. You are not giving to maintain a relationship that would fall apart without your constant effort. You are giving because you choose to. Fully. Freely. Without a hidden invoice attached. And this kind of giving has a completely different quality, not just for you, but for the person receiving it. People can feel the difference between receiving something that was freely given and receiving something that was grudgingly extracted. They may not be able to articulate it. They may not even be consciously aware of it. But at some level, they register it. They feel the warmth of genuine generosity in a way that they never feel the hollow performance of compulsive giving. Strength-based kindness also has a natural limit, and that limit is part of what makes it genuine. When you give from strength, you give what you can afford to give. You help when helping serves both people well. You say yes from a place of genuine willingness, which means your yes actually means something. And when you cannot give, when the cost is too high, when the request crosses a line, when saying yes would require saying no to yourself in a way that is no longer acceptable, you say no. Clearly. Calmly. Without excessive explanation or apology. Not because you do not care, but because you do, including caring for yourself. I want to introduce a concept that I think captures this distinction beautifully. Grounded generosity. Grounded generosity is kindness that flows from a stable, rooted sense of self. It is warmth that does not require the other person's gratitude to sustain it. It is giving that does not deplete you because it comes from genuine surplus, from having tended to your own needs, your own boundaries, your own inner life, rather than from the anxious scraping together of resources you cannot afford to part with. A person practicing grounded generosity is one of the most genuinely magnetic human beings you will ever encounter. They are warm without being desperate for connection, generous without being a pushover, present without being suffocating, caring without being controlling. They give you their attention and their honesty, and because they could withhold both if they chose to, the giving of both feels like a genuine gift. They are kind, deeply, authentically, sustainably kind, in a way that fear-based kindness never manages to be. Because their kindness is not about you. It is an expression of them. And that distinction, between kindness as performance and kindness as expression, is what transforms it from a trap into a superpower. There is a safety instruction given on every commercial flight that contains, within its practical simplicity, one of the most important philosophical principles of a well-lived life. In the event of a loss of cabin pressure, secure your own oxygen mask before assisting others. Every passenger hears this instruction. Most understand it logically. And yet in the context of their actual lives, in the context of relationships, responsibilities, and the daily demands of existence, most people do the opposite. They spend their days administering oxygen to everyone around them, quietly suffocating, wondering why they feel so tired, so invisible, so chronically depleted. The oxygen mask principle is not selfishness. It is the fundamental understanding that you cannot sustain giving from an empty vessel. That the most genuinely useful, most genuinely kind thing you can do for the people who depend on you is to ensure that you are capable of showing up fully, with energy, with clarity, with genuine warmth, rather than the hollow performance of someone running on empty. Self-care, in this context, is not an indulgence. It is the prerequisite for everything else. When you tend to yourself, when you honor your own needs, protect your own energy, maintain your own emotional equilibrium, you become more capable of genuine kindness, not less. You give more effectively. You love more authentically. You show up more fully. Because you are not pretending anymore. There is a particular challenge that arises for people who have been operating from fear-based kindness for a long time. And it is this. The identity of the selfless, giving, always available person has become genuinely comfortable. Familiar, at least. It is a role you know how to play. It has its own rewards, the gratitude, however fleeting. The sense of being needed. The identity of being the good one, the reliable one, the one who holds everything together. Releasing that identity is not a simple or painless process, because it requires you to sit with the question of who you are without it. If you are not the one who always gives, who are you? If you are not the one who always shows up, regardless of the cost, what is your value? If you stop performing selflessness, will you still be lovable? These questions are not rhetorical. They are among the most important questions you will ever ask yourself. And the answers, when you find them, and you will find them, will not come from outside you. They will come from the slow, patient, often uncomfortable process of turning inward, of getting to know the self that has been quietly waiting behind the performance, of discovering that you are not only lovable without the performance, you are more lovable, more real, more present, more capable of the kind of deep, genuine connection that the performance was always trying, and always failing to secure. The kindness that lives on the other side of fear is not smaller than what you have been practicing. It is infinitely larger. Let us be concrete for a moment, because philosophical principles are only as useful as their practical expression. What does strength-based kindness actually look like in a real life, on an ordinary day? It looks like a friend who listens deeply and offers honest perspective, even when the honest perspective is not what you want to hear, because they respect you enough to tell you the truth rather than comfort you with a beautiful lie. It looks like a colleague who offers genuine help on a project, and who also, clearly and without resentment, communicates when they do not have the capacity to take on more, because their help, when given, is real, and their limits, when stated, are respected. It looks like a partner who is warm and affectionate and fully present, and who also, clearly and calmly, addresses things that are not working, because they value the relationship enough to be honest about it, rather than slowly poisoning it with unexpressed resentment. It looks like a person who gives compliments that mean something, because they also give critiques that are honest, whose approval registers as genuinely earned, because their disapproval is also possible. In each of these cases, the kindness is real precisely because the person delivering it is real, fully present, fully themselves, not performing, not managing perceptions, not giving from fear of what will happen if they do not, just, present, honest, grounded, kind. That is the version of you that is possible. That is the version of you that is waiting quietly and patiently on the other side of the fear. As we close this chapter, I want to leave you with something to sit with. Not a task. Not an action item. Just a question, offered gently, to carry with you into the days ahead. The next time you are about to do something kind, before you act, before you respond, before you give, pause for just a moment. And ask yourself, honestly and without judgment, one simple question. Am I doing this because I want to, or because I am afraid of what happens if I do not? You do not need to change anything yet. You do not need to act differently based on the answer. Just notice. Because awareness, quiet and unglamorous as it is always the first movement of change. And the ability to distinguish between the kindness that expands you and the kindness that diminishes you, that single ability, will begin to shift everything. Slowly. Surely. From the inside out. In Chapter 5, we move into one of the most practically powerful areas of this entire audiobook, the language of respect. How the specific words you use, the pace at which you speak, the way you explain yourself or choose not to, the apologies you offer and the ones you withhold, all of it communicates something about your value. And all of it can be changed. Not artificially. Not as a performance. But as a genuine reflection of the new relationship you are building with yourself. Chapter 5. The language of respect. How you speak determines how you are treated. Words are never just words. Every sentence you speak, every phrase you choose, every pause you allow or fill with nervous chatter, all of it is communicating something far beyond the literal meaning of the words themselves. It is communicating your relationship with yourself, your sense of your own worth, your belief, conscious or otherwise, about whether you deserve to be heard, to be taken seriously, to be treated with consideration and respect. Most people understand this in theory, but very few people have sat down and looked honestly at the specific verbal habits they have developed over a lifetime, the small, subtle patterns of speech that quietly signal to the world exactly how they expect to be treated. And the world, without fail, obliges. This chapter is about those patterns. About the language of self-diminishment that most kind, agreeable people have been speaking so long it has become invisible to them. And about the language of self-respect, not aggressive, not arrogant, not performatively assertive, but calm, clear, and grounded in the quiet certainty of someone who knows their own worth. Because the way you speak is not just a reflection of how you feel about yourself. Over time, it becomes a cause of it. From the time we learn to speak, we are absorbing not just vocabulary and grammar, but the emotional architecture of language. We learn which words make people comfortable and which ones create tension. We learn how to soften a request so it does not sound demanding. How to frame a disagreement so it does not sound confrontational. How to express a need in a way that is so heavily qualified and apologized for that it barely registers as a need at all. For people who grew up in environments where directness felt dangerous, where asking for things led to disappointment, where expressing opinions led to conflict, where taking up space felt like an imposition, this invisible script becomes deeply ingrained. It becomes the default. And it shows up everywhere. It shows up in the way you begin sentences with "I'm sorry" before saying something that requires no apology whatsoever. It shows up in the way you end statements with upward inflections that turn them into questions, as though you are perpetually seeking permission to hold your own opinions. It shows up in the way you over-explain your decisions to people who never asked for an explanation, as though your choices require external validation to be legitimate. It shows up in the emails you spend 45 minutes writing because you are terrified of sounding too direct, too demanding, too much. In the way you laugh nervously after expressing a view, as though preemptively apologizing for having one. In the way you say "Does that make sense?" after every other sentence, not because your point was unclear, but because you are quietly, constantly seeking reassurance that you are acceptable. These habits feel like politeness. They feel like consideration for others. But underneath the social veneer, they are communicating something very specific to every person you interact with. They are communicating uncertainty, anxiety, a deep, unresolved question about whether you and your perspective are worth taking seriously. And people respond to that communication, not unkindly, in most cases, but inevitably, by taking you slightly less seriously than they otherwise would. Let us begin with perhaps the most common and most costly verbal habit of the chronically kind person. The over-apology. "I'm sorry to bother you, but..." "Sorry, this might be a stupid question." "I'm sorry, I just feel like..." "Sorry for the late reply." "Sorry, do you mind if I..." The apology has become so reflexive, so automatic, so thoroughly woven into the fabric of ordinary communication, that most people who do it are not even aware of it anymore. It has ceased to be an expression of genuine remorse for a genuine error. It has become a verbal tick, a constant, low-level signal of deference. A way of entering every interaction already one step below the other person, already positioned as someone who is slightly in the wrong simply for existing and having needs. Here is what the over-apology actually communicates, beneath its surface of social nicety. I am aware that my presence, my needs, and my perspective might be an inconvenience to you. I am preemptively acknowledging that inconvenience in the hope that it will make you less likely to reject or dismiss me. That is not politeness. That is a posture of emotional submission. And the cost of it extends beyond the individual interaction. When you apologize constantly, for things that do not warrant apology, for simply having needs, for simply existing and taking up space, you train yourself to experience your own existence as an imposition. You internalize the apology. You begin to believe it. The shift away from over-apologizing is not about becoming someone who never acknowledges wrongdoing. Genuine apologies for genuine errors, offered clearly and without excessive self-flagellation, are a sign of integrity and maturity. The shift is about reserving the apology for moments when it is actually warranted. And in all other moments, simply speaking. Without the preemptive disclaimer. Without the verbal bow of deference. Just the words. Clear and direct and unafraid. I have a question. Not, sorry to bother you, I know you're busy, but I just had a quick question if that's okay. I need a few days to think about that. Not, I'm so sorry, I hope this isn't a problem, but I was wondering if maybe I could possibly have a little more time. I disagree. Not, I'm sorry, this is probably wrong, but I kind of feel like maybe there might be another way to look at it. The difference in those sentences is not just stylistic. It is the difference between a person who believes their perspective has inherent value and a person who is perpetually seeking permission to have one. Closely related to the over-apology is the over-explanation, the habit of justifying your decisions, your choices, and your limits to people who never asked for a justification. I can't make it Saturday because I have this thing and my friend is in town, and I've also been really tired lately, and I know we haven't seen each other in a while, and I feel really bad about it. When the only thing that needed to be said was, I can't make it Saturday. The over-explanation is rooted in the same anxiety as the over-apology. It is the belief that your choices, particularly the ones that involve prioritizing yourself, saying no, or simply living your life in a way that does not revolve around other people's expectations, require external validation to be legitimate. They do not. You are an adult. Your decisions about your own time, your own energy, your own life do not require a committee vote. They do not require the other person's understanding or approval, however much you might hope for it. When you over-explain, you do several things simultaneously, none of them helpful. You signal that you feel guilty about your decision, which invites the other person to either reassure you or, in some cases, to use that guilt as leverage. You open the door to negotiation that did not need to be opened, because where there is an explanation, there is an implicit invitation to argue with it. And you communicate, once again, that your choices are provisional, subject to revision, dependent on whether the other person accepts your reasoning. A person who respects themselves does not operate this way. They make decisions. They communicate those decisions clearly. And they trust, without needing constant external confirmation, that they are entitled to make them. Beyond the apologies and the over-explanations, there is a broader category of verbal habits that could be described as shrinking language, words and phrases that systematically diminish the weight and authority of what you are saying. Just, as in, I just wanted to check in, or I just thought maybe, or I just need a minute. The word just, used in this way, is a minimizer. It signals that whatever follows is small, unimportant, barely worth mentioning. It apologizes for the request before making it. Kind of and sort of and maybe, used not to express genuine uncertainty, but to soften a clear statement until it has no edges left. I kind of feel like this isn't working. What you mean is, this is not working. But the hedging language transforms a clear observation into something so tentative and qualified that it can easily be dismissed. Does that make sense? Asked not because the listener seems confused, but as a reflexive bid for reassurance. A way of checking again and again whether you are acceptable, whether your thoughts are worth receiving. I don't know if this is right, but used as a preemptive defense against criticism. If you undermine your own point before anyone else can, the rejection, if it comes, will hurt less. But the cost of this strategy is that you have already communicated to everyone in the room that you do not fully stand behind your own ideas. Each of these habits, individually, seems small, but they accumulate. They paint a picture of someone who is not quite sure they deserve to be heard, who is perpetually bracing for dismissal, who has learned to make themselves and their perspective as small and inoffensive as possible, in the hope that if they take up very little space, no one will ask them to leave. The antidote is not to swing to the opposite extreme, to become aggressive, domineering, or oblivious to the feelings of others. The antidote is simply to speak with the quiet confidence of someone who believes that what they have to say is worth saying. Directly. Clearly. Without unnecessary embellishment or apology. Not because you are more important than anyone else, but because you are equally important. And that equality deserves to be reflected in the language you use. There is an aspect of language that most people overlook entirely when they think about communication. Silence. For many people who struggle with overkindness and people-pleasing, silence is deeply uncomfortable. The absence of words feels dangerous, like a gap that might be filled with tension, with disapproval, with a terrible uncertainty of not knowing what the other person is thinking. And so they fill it. With chatter, with reassurances, with unnecessary explanations and nervous laughter and the constant exhausting effort of keeping the conversational temperature comfortable for everyone in the room. But silence, used consciously and without anxiety, is one of the most powerful communicative tools available to you. Consider what happens when someone makes a request you are not sure about, and instead of immediately responding, instead of rushing to fill the gap with either an eager yes or an over-apologetic no, you simply pause. You think. You consider. You take up the time you need. That pause communicates something profound. It communicates that you are not at the mercy of other people's expectations. That your responses are considered rather than reflexive. That you have an internal world that you consult before acting, and that this internal world matters more to you than the other person's momentary comfort with the silence. People who are comfortable with silence are perceived as thoughtful, composed, and confident. People who cannot tolerate silence are perceived as anxious, as though they need the constant reassurance of noise to feel safe. Learning to sit with silence, in conversations, in negotiations, in moments of conflict or discomfort, is one of the most immediately powerful changes you can make in the way you communicate. It does not require new vocabulary. It does not require any words at all. It simply requires the willingness to stop filling every empty space with proof that you are agreeable. Beyond specific vocabulary and verbal habits, there is something even more fundamental that shapes how your communication is received. Tone. Not just the emotional register of your voice, though that matters, but the deeper quality of certainty or uncertainty that underlies everything you say. You can say a perfectly assertive sentence in a tone that completely undermines it. I need you to respect my time delivered in a voice that is tight with anxiety, that rises at the end like a question, that carries the slight tremor of someone who is not sure they have the right to make this demand, lands entirely differently than the same sentence delivered in a calm, even, unhurried tone that carries within it the absolute absence of doubt. The words are the same. The message received is entirely different. Because tone carries the truth beneath the words. And the truth beneath the words, for most chronically kind people, is fear. The work of developing a tone that commands respect is not about lowering your voice or performing authority. It is about doing the internal work, the work of this entire audiobook, that gradually replaces the fear beneath your words with something steadier. Certainty. Self-possession. The quiet, unshakable knowledge that you are someone worth listening to. When that internal shift happens, even partially, even imperfectly, it shows up in your voice without you having to manufacture it. Your pace slows slightly, because you are no longer rushing to get your words out before someone talks over you. Your tone settles, because you are no longer bracing for rejection with every sentence. Your pauses become comfortable rather than panicked, because you are no longer terrified of what happens in the spaces between your words. You begin to sound like someone who believes what they are saying. And people begin to respond accordingly. There is a particular kind of communication that tests everything we have discussed in this chapter, and it is the kind that matters most. Honest communication in difficult moments. The moment when someone says something that hurts you, and instead of the usual deflection or silence, you address it. The moment when you disagree with someone in a meeting, and instead of letting it go, you calmly and clearly say so. The moment when a pattern in a relationship has gone on long enough, and instead of hoping it will somehow resolve itself, you name it. These moments are where the language of self-respect becomes most essential and most challenging. Because in these moments, The old programming runs loudest. The fear of conflict, of disapproval, of being perceived as difficult or demanding, it rises up with particular force precisely because the stakes feel higher. And yet these are the moments that define the quality of your relationships more than almost any other. Because how you handle difficulty communicates, more powerfully than anything else, what you believe about your own worth. A person who can address a difficult moment with calm, clear honesty, without aggression, without excessive emotion, without apology for having a perspective, is a person who has something that most people spend their whole lives wishing they had. The ability to be real. In the most important moments. With the people who matter most. I want to offer you something practical before we close this chapter. Not a script. Not a set of lines to memorize and deploy. But a small collection of reframes, simple shifts in language that carry within them a fundamentally different relationship to your own worth. Instead of "I'm sorry to bother you," simply begin with what you need to say. The other person's attention is not a favor you are begging for. It is something you have every right to request. Instead of "I could be wrong, but try in my view," or "from where I stand." Own your perspective without preemptively undermining it. Instead of "I don't mind either way" when you actually do mind, try "I'd prefer." Preferences are not demands. They are honest expressions of a real person with a real inner life. Instead of a 3-paragraph explanation for why you cannot do something, try "That doesn't work for me." Full stop. No further justification required. Instead of "Does that make sense?" as a bid for reassurance, try silence. Or if you genuinely want engagement, "What are your thoughts?" which invites the other person in rather than seeking their permission. These are small changes. But language shapes thought as much as thought shapes language. And as you begin to speak differently, even imperfectly, even inconsistently at first, you will find that something in your internal experience begins to shift alongside it. Because every time you speak without apologizing for your own existence, you send a message. Not to the other person. To yourself. And that message, repeated enough times, in enough moments, across enough interactions, begins to accumulate into something remarkable. A new belief about who you are. And who you are allowed to be. Before we move forward, I want to pause here and do something a little different. Because we have covered a great deal of ground in this chapter, and some of it may have landed in places that are deeply personal. So, I want to ask you something directly. Of all the verbal habits we have discussed in this chapter, the over-apologizing, the over-explaining, the shrinking language, the inability to sit with silence, which one do you recognize most in yourself? And more importantly, can you think of one specific relationship in your life, one specific person, where changing the way you speak could change everything? Leave that in the comments. Not because I need to know, but because the act of naming it, of pulling it out of the vague, uncomfortable fog of self-awareness and putting it into specific, concrete words, is itself a powerful act of clarity. And clarity, as we have seen, is always where change begins. In Chapter 6, we move into one of the most transformative and most misunderstood concepts in the entire landscape of self-development. Boundaries. Not as walls. Not as weapons. But as the quiet, essential architecture of a life lived on your own terms. We are going to examine what boundaries actually are, where the resistance to them comes from, and how to begin building them, not from anger or fear, but from the deep-settled knowledge of someone who finally knows what they deserve. Chapter 6. Boundaries are not walls, they are the architecture of self-respect. The word boundary has been used so frequently in recent years that it has begun to lose its meaning. It has become a buzzword. A piece of therapy-adjacent vocabulary that people throw into conversations without always understanding what it truly means, where it truly comes from, or why it is so much harder to implement in real life than it sounds in theory. So before we go any further, let us set aside everything you think you know about boundaries, every Instagram caption, every self-help soundbite, every oversimplified instruction to simply set limits and enforce them, and let us look at what a boundary actually is. At its core, a boundary is not a rule you impose on other people. It is a truth you honor about yourself. It is the lived expression of your values, your needs, and your limits, translated into the way you allow yourself to be treated, the situations you will and will not enter, the behaviors you will and will not accept. It is not a wall built to keep people out. It is not a weapon used to punish people who have hurt you. It is not a performance of self-respect designed to impress others with how unbothered you are. It is simply the architecture of a life lived in alignment with who you actually are. And when you understand it that way, everything about how you build and maintain boundaries changes. If boundaries were simply a matter of knowing what you want and saying so, they would not be the subject of entire books, entire therapy sessions, entire chapters of audiobooks like this one. The reason boundaries are difficult, genuinely, profoundly difficult for many people, is not a lack of knowledge about what they are. It is the emotional weight of what it feels like to enforce them. Because enforcing a boundary almost always involves, at some level, the risk of someone's disappointment. And for a person whose nervous system was wired in childhood to experience someone else's disappointment as a genuine threat, as a precursor to withdrawal of love, to conflict, to abandonment, that risk does not feel small. It does not feel like a minor social discomfort. It feels like danger. The heart rate increases. The stomach tightens. The mind begins to generate rapid, anxious calculations. If I say this, they will think that. If I hold this line, they will react this way. Maybe it is not worth it. Maybe I am being too sensitive. Maybe I should just let it go this once. And then you let it go. Again. And the boundary that needed to exist, the one that would have protected your energy, your dignity, your sense of self, dissolves before it was ever fully formed, leaving you once again with that specific exhaustion that comes not from doing too much, but from repeatedly failing to honor what you know to be true about yourself. Understanding this, understanding that the difficulty of boundaries is emotional and physiological, not just intellectual, is the first step toward building them in a way that actually holds. In working through why boundaries collapse, it helps to identify the three most common ways people fail to establish them effectively. The first failure is having no boundaries at all. This is the most visible pattern. The person who says yes to everything, who has no apparent limits, who absorbs the needs and demands of others like a sponge absorbs water. This person is often the one who ends up most visibly exhausted, most visibly resentful, most visibly depleted. Their lack of limits is apparent to everyone around them, and as we explored in Chapter 3, it quietly erodes the respect others hold for them, not out of cruelty, but simply because human beings instinctively perceive limitlessness as a signal of low self-worth. The second failure is walls instead of boundaries. This is the overcorrection, and it is worth examining carefully, because it is often what happens when someone who has had no boundaries for a long time finally snaps. Having absorbed too much for too long, they swing to the opposite extreme. They become closed, defended. They stop trusting people preemptively, push intimacy away, and confuse emotional armor with self-respect. Walls keep pain out, but they keep connection out too. They are not boundaries. They are the evidence of wounds that have not yet been processed. And while they are understandable, deeply, humanly understandable, they are not the solution we are working toward here. The third failure is inconsistent boundaries, limits that are stated but not maintained. The person who says no and then, under sufficient pressure or guilt, says yes. Who establishes a standard in one conversation and abandons it in the next. Whose limits are negotiable depending on the other person's emotional response. This pattern is perhaps the most quietly damaging of the three, because it teaches the people around you that your limits are not real. That they are opening positions in a negotiation rather than genuine expressions of your values. And it creates a dynamic in which the people in your life learn, consciously or not, that applying enough pressure will eventually move you. Each of these three failures has a solution. And that solution is the same in all three cases. It is the development of boundaries that are rooted not in rules, not in reactions, and not in other people's behavior, but in a clear, settled, deeply personal understanding of your own values. Here is what most conversations about boundaries miss. A boundary without a value underneath it is just a rule. And rules in the absence of meaning are difficult to maintain, because when the pressure comes, when the guilt arrives, when the other person pushes back with hurt or anger or disappointment, a rule gives you very little to stand on. But a value, a deeply held, clearly understood sense of what matters to you and why, that is something you can stand on with both feet. Consider the difference. A rule says, I do not lend money to friends. A value says, I have learned that mixing money and friendship damages both, and I value my relationships and my financial peace too much to risk either. The rule is brittle. The value is rooted. When someone asks to borrow money and you are operating from a rule, their disappointment or their need or their persuasive argument has the power to move you. Because rules are external. They can be argued with, negotiated around, or simply overridden by a sufficiently strong emotional pull. But when you are operating from a value, when you are standing on the clear, personal, lived understanding of why this matters to you, their response, however difficult to witness, does not change the ground beneath your feet. You are not refusing them because of a rule. You are honoring yourself because of who you are and what you have learned. That distinction, between boundary as rule and boundary as value, is everything. It is the difference between a limit that holds and a limit that collapses the moment it is tested. How you communicate a boundary matters enormously. Not because the right words will prevent all conflict or ensure that everyone responds with grace and understanding, they will not. But because the way you express a limit communicates, at a very deep level, how you feel about having it. And if you feel guilty about your limit, if you apologize for it, over-explain it, offer excessive justification or preemptive appeasement, you are communicating, however unintentionally, that you are not entirely sure the limit is valid, that it might be negotiable, that the right response from the other person might be able to move you. This is an invitation to be pushed. The most effective boundaries are expressed with a particular quality, calm, clear, and without apology. Not harsh. Not cold. Not delivered with a barely contained anger of someone who has waited too long to speak. But simple. Direct. Stated as fact rather than request. There is a world of difference between these two sentences. I am so sorry. I know this is probably inconvenient and I feel terrible about it, but I just really cannot take on any more right now. I hope you understand. And this. I cannot take that on right now. The first sentence is a negotiation. It signals discomfort, apologizes for the limit before it has even been challenged, and invites the other person to reassure you, push back, or wait for you to talk yourself out of it. The second sentence is a statement. It is calm. It is clear. It leaves no obvious opening for negotiation because it is not asking for permission. Notice, the second sentence is not rude. It is not cold. It does not include an attack on the other person or a lengthy justification of your reasoning. It is simply the truth, stated plainly. And plain truth, delivered with warmth and without apology, is one of the most powerful forms of communication available to you. Stating a boundary is one thing. Holding it when it is tested is another. And it will be tested. Particularly by people who have been accustomed to a version of you that had no limits. Because when you change, when you begin to communicate clearly about what you will and will not accept, the people around you do not automatically adjust with grace and celebration. Some of them push back. Some of them express hurt. Some express anger. Some withdraw. Some deploy guilt with extraordinary precision, finding the exact words most likely to make you feel selfish, unreasonable, or unkind. And in those moments, in the discomfort of someone's displeasure, in the face of the exact emotional response that has always moved you before, you will feel the pull to relent. This is the critical moment. Not because what you should do in that moment is always easy. It is not. But because what you do in that moment determines everything. It either confirms to the other person, and to yourself, that your limit is real, or it teaches both of you that it is not. There are a few things worth remembering when the test comes. The first is that the other person's discomfort is not your responsibility to fix. You can acknowledge it. You can be compassionate about it. You can hold space for the fact that your change is creating a disruption in a dynamic they were comfortable with. But you are not responsible for managing their emotional response to your self-respect. That distinction between empathy and responsibility is critical. You can feel for someone without taking ownership of their feelings. You can care about their experience without abandoning your own. The second thing to remember is that a reasonable person will adjust. Not always immediately. Not always without friction. But someone who genuinely cares about you and the relationship, someone whose regard for you is real rather than contingent on your compliance, will, with time, find a new equilibrium. They will adapt to the new terms. They may even come to respect you more for having established them. The people who do not adjust, who continue to push, who escalate their response, who make your self-respect feel like an act of aggression against them, are showing you something important. They are showing you the true nature of the dynamic you have been maintaining. And that information, however painful, is a gift. Here is a reframe that I want to offer, one that many people find genuinely transformative when they first encounter it. Boundaries are not just an act of self-respect. They are an act of love. This sounds counterintuitive at first. Because we have been taught, often implicitly, that love means unlimited availability. That caring deeply means being willing to give without limit. That the boundaries we set are somehow in opposition to the love we feel. But consider what boundaryless love actually does to relationships over time. When you have no limits with someone you love, when you give endlessly, absorb endlessly, accommodate endlessly, you do not create a deeper relationship. You create an unbalanced one. And unbalanced relationships, however much love exists within them, breed resentment, contempt, and the slow erosion of genuine intimacy. Your limits, when expressed with love, actually protect the relationship. They prevent the buildup of resentment that destroys connection from the inside. They maintain the mutual respect that keeps love alive over time. They signal to the other person that you are someone, a real person, with a real inner life, with real needs and limits, and not just a service they can access without restriction. And in doing so, they make the love that exists between you more real. Because you cannot truly love someone you do not truly see. And you cannot truly be loved by someone who has only ever encountered your performance. Your boundaries are the invitation for real love to begin. So how do you actually begin? If you have spent years, perhaps your entire adult life, operating without clear limits, the idea of suddenly developing them can feel overwhelming. Where do you start? How do you identify what your boundaries actually are? How do you begin to communicate them to people who have never experienced this version of you? The answer, as with most genuine transformation, is slowly, carefully, with compassion for yourself in the process. Begin by getting quiet and asking yourself a simple, powerful question. Where in my life do I consistently feel resentful, depleted, or taken for granted? Follow that feeling. Because resentment, for all its unpleasantness, is one of the most reliable indicators of a violated limit. It is the signal that something is costing you more than you consciously agreed to pay. It is your inner world telling you, in the only language available to it, that something here is not aligned with who you are and what you need. Every area of your life where resentment lives is an area where a boundary is needed. Start there. Not with a dramatic conversation or a sudden ultimatum, but with clarity, with the private, unhurried work of getting clear with yourself about what you actually need, what you actually value, and what you are no longer willing to accept. Because the boundary begins inside you, long before it is ever spoken aloud. It begins the moment you decide, quietly, firmly, irreversibly, that you matter enough to protect. In Chapter 7, we take everything we have built in this chapter and apply it to one of the most specific and most feared skills in the entire landscape of self-respect, the art of saying no. Not the theory of it. The actual practice. The words, the feelings, the guilt, the aftermath. And how to move through all of it without losing yourself or the people you love. Chapter 7. The art of saying no without guilt, without apology, without losing relationships. There is a two-letter word that has the power to change your life. And most people are absolutely terrified of it. No. Not because they do not know the word. Not because they are incapable of forming the sound. But because somewhere in the architecture of their emotional world, that word has become loaded with so much weight, so much anticipated guilt, so much feared consequence, so much imagined damage to the relationships they value, that saying it feels less like exercising a right and more like committing an act of violence. So instead, they say yes. Again and again and again. Yes, when they are exhausted. Yes, when they are overwhelmed. Yes, when every honest part of them is pulling in the opposite direction. Yes, because the alternative, the discomfort of someone's disappointment, the risk of someone's anger, the unbearable possibility of being seen as selfish or difficult or unkind, feels worse than whatever saying yes will cost them. And it costs them enormously. Every yes that should have been a no carries a weight. It is not always immediately felt. In the moment, the relief of avoiding conflict can feel almost like lightness. The tension dissolves, the other person is satisfied, the situation moves on. And for a brief window, you might even convince yourself that it was the right call. That it was not so bad. That you can manage it. But the weight accumulates. It sits in the body as fatigue. It sits in the mind as a low, persistent irritability that you cannot quite trace to its source. It sits in your relationships as a growing distance, because every time you said yes while meaning no, you moved a little further from your own truth and a little further from the possibility of being genuinely known by the person you said it to. And over time, the accumulated weight of misplaced yes becomes one of the heaviest things a person can carry. Not because any single one of them was catastrophic, but because together, they form a pattern. A pattern that says, to you, and to everyone watching, my needs are negotiable. My time is available to anyone who asks. My limits do not exist. And once that pattern is established, it takes on a life of its own. We have already explored in earlier chapters the psychological roots of people-pleasing, the childhood conditioning, the fear of abandonment, the belief that love must be earned through compliance. But it is worth pausing here, specifically on the act of saying no, because the fear attached to this particular word has its own specific texture. When you are about to say no to someone, when you feel that word forming in your mind and feel simultaneously the wave of anxiety that accompanies it, what is it precisely that you are afraid of? For most people, if they trace it honestly, the fear is not really about the immediate situation. It is about what the no might mean. It might mean they think I am selfish. It might mean they stop liking me. It might mean they leave. It might mean I am not a good person. These fears are not facts. They are stories, old familiar stories, formed long ago in emotional environments that no longer define your life. But they feel like facts. They carry the weight of lived experience. And until they are examined clearly, they will continue to function as invisible barriers between you and the simple fundamental right to decline. The truth, the actual observable truth of how a thoughtfully delivered no functions in a healthy relationship, is almost always different from the story the fear tells. A thoughtfully delivered no does not destroy relationships. In most cases, it deepens them. One of the most important distinctions you can make, and one that will immediately begin to reduce the fear attached to this word, is the distinction between saying no to a request and rejecting a person. These are not the same thing. When you decline to lend money, you are not saying the person is unworthy of your care. When you cannot attend an event, you are not saying the relationship does not matter to you. When you choose not to take on more work, you are not saying your colleague's project is unimportant. You are simply saying, this particular request, at this particular moment, is not something I am able or willing to do. That is a statement about the request. It is not a statement about the person making it. Most of us, somewhere in our emotional wiring, have conflated the two. We have assumed that because someone's request feels personal to them, our response to it must carry personal meaning. That declining is inherently a form of rejection. But consider how you feel when someone says no to you with warmth and clarity. When a friend says I cannot make it this time, but I genuinely want to see you, Can we find another time? Do you feel rejected? Or do you feel, perhaps, a quiet respect for the fact that they were honest with you, rather than showing up resentfully or canceling at the last minute? Most people, when a no is delivered with genuine warmth and without cruelty, do not experience it as rejection. They experience it as honesty. And honesty, in a relationship, is always a deeper form of respect than comfortable dishonesty. So, what does a well-delivered no actually sound like? There are a few principles worth understanding. The first is brevity. A no does not require a lengthy explanation. It does not require a detailed account of your schedule, your energy levels, your competing priorities, or your personal history with similar situations. Over-explanation is a form of apologizing. It signals that you feel your limit needs to be justified, which signals that you are not entirely sure it is valid. A clean no is short. It is clear. It contains enough warmth to communicate that the relationship matters, but enough firmness to communicate that the answer is not a negotiation. The second principle is the absence of excessive apology. There is a difference between acknowledging that your no creates an inconvenience and apologizing for having a limit in the first place. The first is considerate. The second is self-undermining. "I am sorry, I cannot help with that" is reasonable. "I am so sorry, I feel terrible, I really wish I could, I hate letting you down," is a person who has not yet fully accepted their own right to decline. The third principle is no justification required. You are allowed to say no without giving a reason. This is, for many people, one of the most challenging ideas in this entire audiobook, because the habit of justifying every limit is so deeply ingrained that doing without it feels almost rude. But consider this. When someone says yes to you, they do not typically explain why they are saying yes. They simply say yes. The expectation that a no must always be accompanied by a satisfactory explanation is itself a product of the belief that your limits need to be earned, that they are only valid if they can be sufficiently justified. They do not. Your no is valid because it is yours. Let us get specific, because theory without application is incomplete. Here are some ways a clean, warm, firm no actually sounds in real life. When a colleague asks you to take on additional work you cannot accommodate, "I do not have the capacity for that right now." Full stop. No elaboration required unless you choose to offer it. When a friend asks for a favor that crosses a limit, "That is not something I am able to do, but I hope you find what you need." When a family member applies pressure for your time or energy, "I love you, and I cannot do this." Those two things are both true. When someone pushes back after you have already said no, "I understand you are disappointed." My answer is still no. That last one is particularly important, because one of the most common ways that a no gets overridden is not through a single act of pressure, but through persistence. The other person asks again. They reframe the request. They express more distress. They escalate the emotional temperature. And the key, the single most important skill in maintaining a no, is what therapists sometimes call the broken record technique. Not an argument. Not a new justification. Simply the calm, consistent restatement of the original position. "I understand. My answer is still no." You do not need to win the argument. You do not need to convince them that your limit is reasonable. You simply need to hold the line, quietly, warmly, immovably, until the pressure passes. And it always passes. Let us be honest about something. Even when you deliver a no perfectly, calmly, clearly, warmly, without excessive apology, the guilt often comes anyway. It arrives in the quiet aftermath of the conversation, in the replay of the other person's expression, in the internal interrogation that begins almost immediately. Was that really necessary? Am I being too rigid? Maybe I should have just said yes. This guilt is normal. It is expected. And it is not, despite how it feels, evidence that you did something wrong. It is the emotional echo of an old pattern. The nervous system, trained over years or decades to associate saying no with danger, sending its familiar alarm signals even when the actual situation is safe. The most important thing you can do when this guilt arrives is not to act on it. Do not send the follow-up message walking back your no. Do not call to apologize for having a limit. Do not let the discomfort of the guilt convince you that relenting is the compassionate thing to do. Instead, sit with it. Breathe through it. Let it move through you the way weather moves through a landscape. Acknowledge it without obeying it. Because every time you hold your no in the face of the guilt, every time you let the discomfort pass without collapsing back into compliance, you are doing something profound. You are teaching your nervous system a new truth. That saying no did not destroy anything. That the relationship survived. That you survived. That the feared consequence did not materialize, or if it did, that you were capable of handling it. And with each repetition of that experience, the guilt loses a little of its power. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But steadily, cumulatively, in the quiet accumulation of moments where you chose yourself, and the world did not end. Here is a thought to carry with you as we close this chapter. Your yes is one of the most valuable things you have to offer. Not because you are stingy with it. Not because you are withholding or difficult or selfish. But because when it is given freely, when it comes from genuine willingness rather than fear-driven compliance, it means something. It carries the full weight of your actual presence, your actual care, your actual investment. A yes that could not have been a no is worth very little. But a yes from someone who knows how to say no, that yes is a gift. The person receiving it knows that it is real, that it was chosen, that of all the ways you could have responded, you chose to show up. Fully. Willingly. Without resentment or reservation. That is the yes worth giving. And it is only available to you on the other side of learning to say no. In Chapter 8, we step outside the conversations and into the room itself, into the nonverbal world of presence, posture, and the magnetic quality of someone who commands respect before a single word is spoken. Because so much of how we are perceived and treated has nothing to do with what we say, and everything to do with how we carry ourselves through the world. Chapter 8. Commanding presence: how to walk into any room and be felt before you speak. There is a person you have encountered at some point in your life. You may not remember exactly what they said. You may not even remember the full details of the conversation you had with them. But you remember how it felt to be in the same room as them. There was something about them that registered before they opened their mouth. Something in the way they carried themselves, unhurried, settled, completely at ease in their own skin, that made you instinctively aware of their presence. Not because they were loud. Not because they demanded attention. But because they simply were, fully, quietly, unmistakably, there. The room felt different with them in it. You felt, without being able to explain why, that this was someone worth paying attention to. Someone whose words, when they came, would be worth hearing. Someone whose regard, if extended to you, would mean something. That quality, that ineffable, magnetic, before-you-speak quality, is what we are talking about in this chapter. And it has a name. Presence. Presence is one of those words that gets used frequently and understood imprecisely. It is not charisma in the conventional sense, the loud, extroverted, fill the room with your personality quality that we often associate with natural leaders or performers. In fact, some of the most commanding presences are the quietest people in the room. It is not physical appearance, though the way you carry your body is part of it. It is not status or achievement, though confidence born of genuine competence contributes to it. Presence, at its most fundamental, is the quality of being fully and completely here. In this moment. In this body. In this conversation. Without the low-level distraction of self-monitoring, without the constant, anxious background process of wondering how you are coming across, whether people approve of you, whether you are saying the right things and making the right impressions. Most people, most of the time, are not fully present. They are partially here and partially elsewhere, in their own self-evaluation, in their anticipation of the future, in their management of other people's perceptions. They are performing their way through interactions, rather than actually inhabiting them. And this absence beneath the appearance of presence, is felt by everyone around them, even if it is never consciously identified. The person who is truly present, who has, through inner work and genuine self-acceptance, quieted the anxious self-monitoring enough to simply be in a moment, communicates something to everyone around them that no technique can replicate. They communicate safety, solidity, the rare and deeply reassuring quality of someone who is not trying to be anything other than exactly what they are. And that quality is magnetic in a way that performance never manages to be. Before you say a word in any interaction, your body has already delivered a complete message. Research into human communication has consistently shown that the nonverbal dimensions of an interaction, posture, movement, facial expression, eye contact, the use of space and silence, carry an extraordinary proportion of the meaning received by the other person. Words matter, of course, but they arrive in a context that the body has already established. And for people who have spent years accommodating others, shrinking to avoid conflict, and managing their own visibility to stay safe, that bodily context is often communicating something they would never consciously choose to say. It is communicating smallness. The slightly hunched shoulders that make the body less visible. The gaze that drops first in an interaction, signaling deference before a word is exchanged. The tight, managed quality of the voice when anxiety is present. The way the body turns slightly inward, occupying the minimum possible space, as if apologizing for its own existence. These are not character flaws. They are the physical expression of an internal state, the embodied residue of years spent trying to make yourself less threatening, less demanding, less likely to attract the kind of attention that might lead to conflict or disapproval. But here is the profound connection between the inner work of the previous chapters and the outer expression of this one. As your relationship with yourself changes, as self-respect deepens, as the fear of disapproval loses its grip, as you begin to inhabit your own worth with increasing steadiness, your body changes too. Not overnight, not dramatically, but the posture opens. The breath deepens. The gaze holds longer. The voice settles into its natural register rather than the careful, managed tone of someone trying not to take up too much space. The body, in other words, follows the mind. But the reverse is also true. And that means you can work from both directions simultaneously. Let us talk about posture, not in the superficial sense of simply standing up straight, but in the deeper sense of what your relationship with physical space communicates about your relationship with yourself. The way you occupy space is a statement. A person who stands with their full height, who allows their shoulders to rest back and open rather than curving protectively forward, who takes up the space their body naturally requires without apologizing for it, that person is communicating, entirely without words, that they have a right to be here. That their presence is not an imposition. That they are not asking permission to exist in this moment. This is not aggression. It is not dominance. It is simply the physical expression of someone who has made peace with their own right to occupy the world they are standing in. Contrast this with the person who makes themselves physically small, who sits perched to the edge of their chair as if ready to leave at any moment, who crosses their arms and legs as if containing themselves, who keeps their voice low and their gestures tight as if afraid of accidentally taking up too much room. Both postures communicate something, and both are received by the people around them at a level that bypasses conscious thought entirely. The practical invitation here is not to perform a posture you do not feel. Forced, unnatural body language is immediately apparent to observers and creates a disconnect that is more unsettling than authentic smallness. The invitation is to begin, gently and with genuine curiosity, to notice your habitual relationship with physical space. To ask, where do I make myself smaller than I need to? Where does my body contract in ways that reflect old fear rather than present reality? And what would it feel like in this moment to simply allow myself to be fully here? Start with breath. A single, full, unhurried breath, taken before you enter a room, before you begin a conversation, before a moment that matters, is one of the most powerful presence-establishing tools available to you. It grounds you in your body. It signals to your nervous system that you are safe. And it creates, in the space of a single inhalation, a quality of settledness that others feel immediately. In a world of constant movement and noise, Stillness is one of the rarest and most commanding qualities a person can possess. Most people, when they are uncomfortable, when the social pressure rises, when silence falls, when attention is directed at them in a way that triggers the familiar anxiety of being evaluated, respond with movement. They fill the silence with words. They busy their hands. They shift their gaze, adjust their position, produce the small, constant physical noise of someone who cannot quite settle. This movement is the body's attempt to manage discomfort. And it signals, to everyone observing, that discomfort is present. The person who can be still, who can sit with silence without rushing to fill it, who can hold another person's gaze without blinking first, who can receive a difficult question or a moment of tension without the physical performance of anxiety, that person communicates something profound. They communicate that they are not afraid. Not of the silence. Not of the scrutiny. Not of the discomfort that arises in the gap between what is said and what comes next. And the absence of that particular fear, the fear of simply being seen, of existing in a moment without the protection of constant activity, is one of the most quietly powerful things one human being can communicate to another. Stillness says, I am comfortable here. I am comfortable being seen. I do not need to manage this moment because I trust myself within it. That trust is felt. Immediately. Viscerally. And it commands, without demanding, a quality of attention and regard that no amount of impressive speech can manufacture. Of all the nonverbal channels of communication, eye contact may be the most powerful and the most misunderstood. For people who have spent years in patterns of deference and accommodation, eye contact is often one of the first things to go. The gaze drops in the presence of authority. It slides away in moments of tension. It breaks first in interactions where the unconscious instinct is to signal submission, to make yourself less threatening, less challenging, less likely to provoke a response that feels dangerous. This pattern is deeply ingrained. And it communicates, with every averted glance, a message that you almost certainly did not intend to send. It communicates uncertainty about your own right to be regarded as an equal. The correction is not to stare. Unblinking, aggressive eye contact is its own form of communication, and not a useful one. It is simply to hold. To allow your gaze to rest on the person you are speaking with in a way that is comfortable, natural, and unhurried. To resist the automatic impulse to look away when the interaction becomes intense or when you feel yourself being closely observed. To meet the gaze of someone who challenges you without immediately dropping your own in the unconscious signal of defeat. This takes practice. It will feel uncomfortable at first, particularly if the habit of averting the gaze is long established. But the discomfort is temporary. And what builds in its place, the quiet, steady ability to be seen without flinching, is one of the most direct expressions of self-respect available to you. Because the willingness to be looked at, fully, directly, without hiding, is the nonverbal equivalent of saying I have nothing to be ashamed of. I am here. I am real. And I am not afraid of you seeing that. Your voice is one of the most revealing nonverbal channels you possess. Not the words it carries, but the qualities beneath the words. The pace, the pitch, the volume, the steadiness or the tremor. The way it either fills the space available to it or contracts into something smaller than it needs to be. People who are accustomed to making themselves small tend to speak in ways that reflect that smallness. The voice becomes higher under stress, as the body tightens. The pace accelerates, as if the words need to be delivered quickly before the permission to speak runs out. The sentences end with an upward inflection that turns statements into questions. I think this is the right approach? We should probably try this? Seeking confirmation and approval even in the structure of the sentence itself. These are not flaws. They are patterns. And like all patterns, they can be observed, understood, and gradually changed. The voice that commands respect is not necessarily louder. It is not necessarily deeper, though a relaxed body tends to produce a naturally lower register than an anxious one. It is slower. Unhurried speech is one of the single most powerful vocal adjustments you can make. It communicates that you believe what you are saying is worth hearing, that you are not afraid of the silence between your words. That you trust yourself to complete a thought without rushing to fill every gap with sound. Slow down. Let your words land before the next ones arrive. Allow silence to do some of the work. The space you leave around your words gives them weight. And weight, the settled, unhurried, this is the quality of someone who does not need to perform their intelligence or their worth, is precisely what the voice of genuine presence sounds like. The most revealing test of presence is not how you carry yourself when everything is comfortable. It is how you carry yourself when the pressure is on. When someone challenges you unexpectedly. When a conversation turns tense. When you are criticized, dismissed, or spoken to in a way that is less than respectful. When the emotional temperature of a situation rises and every instinct is pulling you toward either fight or flight. In those moments, in the gap between the provocation and your response, everything we have discussed in this chapter is tested. And the quality that most distinguishes a person of genuine presence in those moments is composure. Not the brittle composure of someone who is suppressing their response through sheer force of will, but the genuine composure of someone who, in that charged moment, is grounded enough in themselves to pause, to breathe, to choose their response rather than merely react to the stimulus. This pause, the moment of stillness between what happens and what you do about it, is one of the most powerful tools available to a human being. It communicates that you are not controlled by the moment, that your response will be chosen rather than automatic, that whatever comes next will come from a place of intention rather than reactivity. And in a world where most people react immediately, where the emotional trigger produces the emotional response with barely a breath between them, the person who can pause, who can remain settled in the face of disruption, who can choose their next move with quiet deliberateness, that person stands out. Not through drama, not through the performance of unruffled coolness, but through the simple, rare, deeply impressive quality of someone who is at home in themselves even when the world around them is not entirely comfortable. That is presence. That is the quality that is felt before you speak, remembered long after you leave, and respected in a way that no amount of impressive language or careful strategy can replicate. It cannot be faked for long, but it can be built. And that building, the deep, patient, inside-out construction of the person you are becoming, is exactly what we will bring together in Chapter 9, where we go to the very foundation of everything. The inner work. The daily disciplines. The private practices and the quiet mindset shifts that make all of this not just possible, but permanent. Chapter 9. The inner work, building the self-respect that makes others respect you automatically. We have covered a great deal of ground together. We have looked honestly at the kindness trap and the psychological roots that created it. We have examined the paradox of respect and what genuine kindness truly means. We have explored the architecture of boundaries, the art of saying no, the language that signals your value, and the presence that commands a room before a single word is spoken. And all of it, every principle, every insight, every practical shift, points back to the same place. You. Specifically, the relationship you have with yourself. Because here is the truth that sits underneath everything else in this audiobook. The truth that all the other chapters have been quietly circling toward. You cannot perform your way to genuine respect. You cannot script your way there. You cannot adopt the right posture, the right tone of voice, the right way of entering a room, and manufacture from the outside in the kind of respect that lasts. That feels real. That changes not just how others treat you, but how you experience yourself from the inside. Genuine respect, the kind that is consistent, sustainable, and deeply felt, is not a social skill. It is an inside job. And the inside job begins with self-respect. Self-respect is one of those concepts that everyone recognizes and almost no one can clearly define. It is often confused with confidence, but they are not the same thing. Confidence is situational. It rises and falls depending on performance, on outcome, on how a particular situation unfolds. A person can be enormously confident in their professional abilities and have almost no self-respect in their personal relationships. Self-respect is deeper than confidence. It is more stable. It is less dependent on external outcome. At its core, self-respect is the settled, unshakable belief that you are worthy of decent treatment, not because of what you have achieved, not because of how useful you are to others, not because of how well you perform the role of the good friend, the good partner, the good employee, but simply because you exist. Because you are a human being with an inner life, with needs and feelings and perspectives that are as valid as anyone else's. Self-respect is the quiet, internal authority that says, I matter. Not more than others, but not less, either. And when that authority is genuinely present, not performed, not claimed, but actually felt, it radiates outward in ways that are impossible to manufacture artificially. It changes the way you speak, the way you move, the way you respond to mistreatment, the kind of relationships you enter and the kind you walk away from. It changes everything, from the inside out. Here is something worth examining honestly. Self-respect is not something you either have or do not have. It is something that is built or eroded, daily, through the accumulation of small choices that either honor your inner life or dismiss it. Every time you silence yourself to keep peace, a small erosion occurs. Every time you accept treatment that you know is beneath you, a small erosion occurs. Every time you dismiss your own feelings as overreactions, talk yourself out of your instincts, apologize for your needs, or make yourself smaller to accommodate someone else's comfort, a small erosion occurs. None of these moments, on their own, feel significant. That is what makes them so dangerous. They are too small to justify a response, too frequent to track, too normalized to seem like the problem they actually are. But add them together across a week, a month, a year, and what you have is not a small erosion at all. You have a canyon. A deep, wide space where your sense of your own worth used to be. Carved out not by any single catastrophic event, but by the quiet, relentless drip of self-abandonment. And filling that canyon, rebuilding what the erosion has taken, is the work of this chapter. The work that makes everything else in this audiobook not just possible, but permanent. Of all the daily practices that build self-respect, there is one that stands above the rest in its simplicity and its power. Keeping the promises you make to yourself. This sounds almost embarrassingly straightforward. And yet for many people, particularly those who have spent years prioritizing everyone else's needs above their own, it is genuinely revolutionary. Think about it. You keep your promises to other people. You show up when you say you will. You follow through on commitments you have made to friends, colleagues, partners. You take the obligations you have to others seriously, because failing to do so feels like a reflection of your character. But the promises you make to yourself, the commitment to exercise, to rest, to create, to pursue something that matters to you, to spend time in ways that nourish rather than deplete, those promises are the first ones sacrificed. The first ones negotiated away. The first ones abandoned the moment someone else's need presents itself. And every time that happens, every time you break a promise to yourself in favor of someone else's agenda, you send yourself a message. You are not a priority, even to yourself. Repeat that message often enough, and it becomes a belief. A belief that quietly shapes every interaction, every relationship, every moment where you must decide how much space to take up and how much to give away. The antidote is not complicated. Begin keeping small promises to yourself. Deliberately. Consistently. Not because anyone else will notice or applaud, they will not. But because every promise kept is a vote cast for the belief that you matter. And enough votes, accumulated over enough time, change the narrative. They build something solid. Something that does not require external validation because it was constructed entirely from within. There is a practice that sits at the heart of inner work, and it is one of the least dramatic and most transformative things you can do. It is the practice of witnessing yourself honestly. Not judging yourself. Not analyzing yourself into paralysis. But simply noticing. Noticing when you feel resentful, and asking what limit was crossed. Noticing when you feel anxious in a relationship, and asking what truth you have been avoiding. Noticing when you feel that familiar pull to shrink, to apologize, to make yourself smaller, and pausing just for a moment before obeying it. This kind of honest self-witnessing is the beginning of all genuine change. Because you cannot shift a pattern you cannot see. And most of the patterns that keep people trapped in cycles of overgiving and undervaluing themselves are invisible, not because they are hidden, but because they have been normalized. They have been happening for so long that they no longer register as choices. They register as personality, as just the way things are. Self-witnessing breaks that spell. It reintroduces you to yourself as someone with agency. Someone who is choosing, moment to moment, how to respond to the world. And someone who, with clarity and practice, can begin to make different choices. For many people, the greatest obstacle to self-respect is not external at all. It is the voice inside their own head. The inner critic, that persistent, often vicious internal narrator that catalogs every flaw, replays every failure, and meets every attempt at growth with a comprehensive list of reasons why you are not enough, is not your enemy. It was once a protector. It developed in environments where self-criticism felt safer than external criticism, where finding your own flaws first felt like a way of staying ahead of the judgment of others, where diminishing yourself internally felt like a form of control in situations where you had very little. But the protector has outstayed its welcome. And the work of healing the inner critic is not to silence it through force or to replace it with hollow affirmations. It is to do something more nuanced and more powerful. It is to learn to speak to yourself the way you would speak to someone you genuinely love. When a close friend fails at something, you do not catalog their inadequacies. You acknowledge their effort. You offer perspective. You remind them of their worth without dismissing the difficulty of their experience. That quality of care, that specific, warm, grounded compassion, is something most people extend freely to others and almost never to themselves. The practice of self-compassion is not softness. It is not the avoidance of accountability. It is the recognition that you are a human being in process. That growth is inherently imperfect. That the same grace you offer freely to others is something you are equally deserving of. And extending that grace to yourself, consistently, deliberately, especially in the moments when you feel you deserve it least, is one of the most profoundly self-respecting things you can do. Self-respect is not only built in the dramatic moments, the confrontations held, the limits maintained, the difficult conversations navigated with grace. It is built in the quiet, ordinary moments of daily life. It is built when you choose rest over the compulsive need to be productive. When you eat in a way that nourishes rather than punishes. When you spend time with people who genuinely see you rather than those who simply use you. When you pursue something that brings you joy for no reason other than that it brings you joy. It is built when you stop treating your own needs as inconveniences to be managed and begin treating them as information to be honored. Your fatigue is telling you something. Your loneliness is telling you something. Your boredom, your restlessness, your persistent sense that something in your life is misaligned. All of it is information. All of it is your inner world attempting, with the tools available to it, to communicate what it needs. The self-respecting person learns to listen. Not with anxiety. Not with the frantic urgency of someone who has been ignoring these signals for so long that they have become crises. But with the calm, attentive care of someone who has decided, finally, fully, irreversibly, that their inner life deserves to be taken seriously. Here is what makes the inner work so powerful, and so worth doing even when it is slow and unglamorous and difficult to measure. It compounds. Every small act of self-respect builds the foundation for the next one. Every promise kept to yourself makes the next promise easier to keep. Every moment of honest self-witnessing makes the next moment of clarity more accessible. Every time you extend compassion to yourself rather than criticism, the inner critic loses a little more of its authority. And gradually, not overnight, not in a straight line, but gradually and unmistakably, something shifts. You begin to notice that the situations you used to find yourself in, the draining relationships, the one-sided dynamics, the patterns of being overlooked and taken for granted, are occurring less frequently. Not because the world has changed, but because you have. Because the person you are now, more grounded, more honest with yourself, more genuinely rooted in your own worth, naturally attracts different experiences. Naturally repels dynamics that would have previously consumed you. Naturally occupies a different quality of space in every room, every relationship, every interaction. This is the compounding effect of inner work. It is quiet. It is patient. It does not announce itself. But it is the most real and the most lasting transformation available to any human being. Before we move to our final chapter, I want to pause here and offer you something. Not an instruction. Not a technique. Just an honest question to sit with. If you were to treat yourself, starting today, in the small and ordinary moments of your daily life, with the same quality of care, patience, and genuine regard that you extend to the people you love most, what would change? What would you stop tolerating? What would you start pursuing? What conversations would you finally have? What situations would you finally leave? What version of yourself, the one that has been quietly waiting behind the performance, behind the compliance, behind the exhausting effort of making yourself acceptable to everyone but yourself, what version of yourself would finally get to show up? Sit with that. Because that version of you is not a fantasy. It is not some distant, idealized self that exists only in the imagination. It is who you actually are, beneath everything that was layered on top of you by fear and conditioning and the long habit of putting yourself last. And it has been waiting, with extraordinary patience, for exactly this moment. In our final chapter, Chapter 10, we bring everything together. Not as a conclusion, but as a beginning. The beginning of a life where you are both kind and powerful, both warm and unshakable, both generous and whole. A life where your kindness is a gift you choose to give, not a tax you are forced to pay. We are almost there. Stay with us. Chapter 10, the new you living as someone who is both kind and powerful. We have arrived at the final chapter. And I want to begin it by acknowledging something. The fact that you are here, that you have stayed with this audiobook through every chapter, through every uncomfortable truth, through every moment of recognition that may have stirred something old and tender inside you, that is not a small thing. Most people encounter ideas like these and move on quickly. They nod along, feel briefly inspired, and then return, almost automatically, to the familiar patterns of their lives. Not because they do not want to change, but because change, real, lasting, structural change, requires something that inspiration alone cannot provide. It requires a decision. Not a dramatic, public declaration. Not a sudden, sweeping transformation that announces itself to everyone around you. But a quiet, private, deeply personal decision. Made in the stillness of an ordinary moment. The kind of decision that does not feel momentous when it happens, and yet, looking back, you will recognize it as the exact point where everything began to shift. Perhaps that decision happened somewhere in Chapter 1, when the description of the kindness trap felt uncomfortably familiar. Perhaps it happened in Chapter 2, when you recognized the child you once were in the patterns you still carry. Perhaps it happened in Chapter 6, or Chapter 7, or Chapter 9, in some quiet moment of clarity when a truth landed not just in your mind but somewhere deeper. Somewhere it could not easily be dislodged. Wherever it happened, if it happened, something in you has already begun to change. And this final chapter is about what comes next. Every chapter of this audiobook has given you a piece of something. An understanding of where overkindness comes from. A new way of seeing the dynamics of respect. A reframe of what genuine kindness actually is. The philosophy and practice of boundaries. The art of saying no. The language and presence of self-respect. The deep, patient, unglamorous inner work of building a relationship with yourself that does not require external validation to sustain it. These pieces, taken individually, are useful. But the real transformation happens when they are integrated, when they stop being separate ideas you consciously apply and become, instead, the natural expression of who you are. That integration is not something that happens in a single conversation or a single moment of insight. It happens in the ordinary texture of daily life. It happens the first time you say no and feel the guilt arrive, and choose to sit with the discomfort rather than collapse back into compliance. It happens the first time someone treats you in a way that is beneath you and something in you responds not with the usual anxious accommodation, but with a quiet, clear, unmistakable no. Not this. It happens in the moment you realize, with something approaching wonder, that you have gone an entire day without monitoring how you are being perceived, without managing someone else's emotional response to you, without shrinking or performing or making yourself smaller to fit into a space that was never the right size for you. Those moments, when they come, will not feel like achievements. They will feel like relief. Like exhaling after holding your breath for a very long time. When you change, genuinely, structurally change, the people in your life will notice. Not always in the way you hope. Some of them will respond with warmth and admiration. They will tell you that you seem different, lighter somehow, more present, more yourself. These are the people whose regard for you was always real, and who recognize, perhaps better than you do, that the person now standing in front of them is more whole than the one they knew before. Hold these people close. But others will respond differently. Some will be unsettled. Some will push back. Some will, consciously or unconsciously, attempt to return you to the previous version of yourself, the version that was easier to take for granted, more predictable in its compliance, less inconveniently insistent on being treated with dignity. They may accuse you of being selfish, of having changed in ways they do not like, of being difficult or cold or, and this one is particularly common, of letting all this self-help content go to your head. When this happens, and it may, I want you to remember something. The resistance you encounter from others when you begin to respect yourself is not evidence that you are doing something wrong. It is evidence that you are doing something real. People who benefited from your lack of limits will naturally resist the development of those limits. Not always out of malice, often simply out of the very human discomfort that comes with any disruption to a familiar dynamic. Their resistance is about them. About their adjustment to a version of you that requires more, offers more, and is no longer willing to quietly disappear in the service of their comfort. Your job is not to manage their adjustment. Your job is to stay the course. Here is one of the most beautiful things that happens when you develop genuine self-respect. The quality of your relationships changes. Not just the existing ones, though those that survive your transformation will almost certainly deepen in ways you could not have anticipated. But the new ones. The connections you begin to attract when you are no longer operating from a place of neediness, from the desperate requirement to be liked, from the willingness to accept any terms just to keep someone close. When you are grounded in your own worth, when you bring a clear, defined, unapologetic self into every relationship, you begin to attract people who are drawn to exactly that. People who have done enough of their own work to value substance over compliance. Who want a real relationship with a real person, not a comfortable arrangement with someone who has made themselves endlessly available and endlessly agreeable. These are the relationships that nourish rather than deplete, that challenge you to grow rather than shrink, that make you feel, in the specific and irreplaceable way that only genuine connection can, that you are truly seen, truly known, truly valued, not for what you do, but for who you are. You cannot find these relationships while you are performing. But the moment you stop, the moment you show up as yourself, limits and all, opinions and all, needs and all, they become possible. And they are worth everything you went through to get there. Before we continue, I want to pause here for a moment. Because we have been on a significant journey together through this audiobook. And I genuinely want to know something. Which chapter hit you the hardest? Was it chapter 1, when we talked about the kindness trap, and you recognized yourself in the description of someone who has been giving too much for too long? Was it chapter 2, when we explored the roots of overkindness and something about your childhood suddenly made a different kind of sense? Was it the respect paradox, the boundaries chapter, the chapter on saying no? Or was it something in chapter 9, the inner work, that landed somewhere deep and quiet and true? Drop it in the comments. Tell me which chapter spoke to you most directly, and why. Because your story matters. And the person reading your comment right now, the one who has been sitting with the same quiet struggle, needs to know they are not alone in it. We began this audiobook with a distinction between kindness that comes from fear and kindness that comes from strength. And I want to return to it here, in this final chapter, because it is the heart of everything. The new you, the person you are becoming through this work, is not a harder version of yourself. Not a colder, more guarded, less generous version. Not someone who has traded warmth for walls or compassion for detachment. The new you is someone who is kind from a completely different place. Not from the anxious, compulsive, fear-driven place that gives because it cannot bear the alternative, but from a place of genuine abundance, of real choice, of the quiet, settled confidence of someone who knows their own worth and gives freely, precisely because they know they do not have to. This is what kindness from power looks like. It is the friend who shows up fully when they show up, because when they cannot, they say so. Clearly. Without drama. Without the performance of reluctance that leaves everyone feeling vaguely guilty. It is the partner who loves deeply and who also, calmly and consistently, holds the limits that keep the relationship honest. Who can say that hurt me without it becoming a crisis, and I need this without it becoming a demand. It is the professional who contributes generously to the people around them, and who also, without apology, knows the value of their time and expertise and communicates that value through the way they move through their work. It is the person who can walk into any room, any relationship, any conversation, and be fully, quietly, unmistakably themselves. Without performance. Without apology. Without the exhausting, invisible effort of managing how they are perceived. That person is magnetic. Not because they are trying to be, but because there is something in the human experience that responds, almost involuntarily, to someone who is simply, completely at home in themselves. We are drawn to integrated people. We trust them. We respect them. We want to be near them because their clarity about themselves somehow makes us feel more clear about ourselves. And that is the gift the new you brings to every life you touch. Not the gift of endless availability or boundless compliance, but the gift of your actual presence, your actual truth, your actual self, whole and grounded and real. That gift, offered freely and from strength, is worth infinitely more than anything the old you was giving away. I want to be honest with you about something as we approach the end of this chapter. This is not a destination. There is no point at which the work is finished. No morning you will wake up and find that the old patterns have vanished entirely. The guilt has dissolved completely. The fear of disapproval has permanently departed. The inner critic will return. Old patterns will resurface, especially in moments of stress or vulnerability. There will be days when saying no feels as hard as it ever did. Days when you catch yourself shrinking, apologizing, accommodating in ways you thought you had moved beyond. This is not failure. This is being human. The difference, the only difference that matters, is what you do in those moments. The old you would not have noticed. Would have moved through the pattern automatically, unconsciously, arriving at the familiar place of depletion and resentment without quite understanding how you got there. The new you notices. And in the noticing, in that small crucial gap between the familiar pull and the automatic response, you have something you did not have before. A choice. Not always an easy one. Not always a clean or comfortable one. But a real one. The genuine, conscious, self-respecting choice of someone who has done enough inner work to know the difference between who they actually are and who their old patterns would have them be. That choice, available to you in every moment, in every interaction, in every situation where the old version of you would have simply complied, is the most powerful thing this audiobook has tried to give you. Not a set of scripts. Not a collection of rules. But the capacity to choose. Before we close, I want to invite you to do something. In your mind, or perhaps in a journal if you have one nearby, I want you to think about the person you were before this audiobook began. The one who said yes when they meant no. Who smiled through the resentment. Who lay awake at night wondering why being so good to everyone left them feeling so invisible. Who gave and gave and gave, and quietly, privately, wondered why it never seemed to be enough. I want you to acknowledge that person. Not with shame. Not with frustration at how long it took to get here. But with a specific, tender compassion that you are now learning to extend to yourself. That person did the best they could with what they had. They found the strategies that kept them safe in the environments they grew up in, and they carried those strategies faithfully into a world that had long since changed. They gave generously, loved deeply, and endured quietly, and even if the giving came from fear, it came from love too. You do not need to be angry at who you were. You just do not need to be them anymore. There is a life available to you on the other side of this work. Not a perfect life. Not a life without difficulty or pain or the ordinary heartbreaks of being a feeling human being in an unpredictable world. But a life that is genuinely yours. A life in which you take up the space you were always meant to occupy. In which your relationships are built on mutual respect rather than quiet desperation. In which your kindness is a joy rather than a burden. In which the person who shows up in the world every day, in every room, every conversation, every relationship, is recognizably, unapologetically, completely you. That life is not waiting for you to become someone different. It is waiting for you to stop pretending to be someone you are not. It is waiting for you to come home to yourself. And the extraordinary thing, the thing that makes all of this work worth doing, that makes every uncomfortable conversation and every held boundary and every moment of sitting with guilt instead of collapsing under it worth it, is that home has been there all along. You just needed to find your way back. If this audiobook has moved you, if something in these 10 chapters touched a truth you have been carrying quietly for a long time, then please take a moment right now to share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment. Share this video. Subscribe for more audiobooks like this one. Because the person who needs this most is probably not looking for it. Which means they need you to bring it to them. Thank you for being here. Thank you for doing this work. And thank you for choosing, perhaps for the first time in a long time, yourself. Until next time.